everyone. Welcome to another episode of Critical Conversations, where we talk about hot topic issues related to American Muslims and other targeted communities. Today we will talk about the rise and resurgence of white supremacist violence and the threat it poses to minority communities. Joining us here in the studio is Dr. Pete Simi, who is the co-author of American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate. Dr. Simi is also Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology at Chapman University. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Simi.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. So to get us started, could you begin by explaining this resurgence that we see in white supremacist violence across the country? Just last month, we saw the Latinx community targeted, and before that, Jewish communities in 2 separate synagogues were targeted, and before that, of course, in Charleston, South Carolina, where a black church was attacked. So could you talk a little bit about why we're seeing this resurgence now, and what is the ideology driving it?
Sure. So I think it's important to point out that the movement that we're dealing with here is an old one that dates back to the founding of the original Ku Klux Klan shortly after the Civil War in the United States. And it's a movement that's ebbed and flowed over time. It has different segments, branches, different groups come and go and so forth. I think a lot of folks started paying more attention to this after Charlottesville. But in terms of the resurgence, we really should go back to 2008 and the election of our first African-American president in terms of Barack Obama. And we, at that time, saw quite a bit of increase in activity among these folks. And so really, it's been a resurgence that's been brewing, largely kind of neglected and unnoticed, and folks have not really paid the kind of attention they should have over the last 10 years or more. It's driven by a number of different factors. One of the most probably salient is what they would call the idea of white genocide or the extinction of the white race. So essentially different types of demographic change that they view as a direct threat to the continual survival of essentially what they call the white race. So this is probably foremost and most probably prominent in terms of, but in addition to that is also the idea of cultural change and increasing kind of embracing multiculturalism and diversity in terms of different traditions and different representations they see as a threat to what they call Western civilization, and they use certain terms like that. These are 2 of the, I would say, drivers, probably the most prominent drivers that you see in terms of these groups, the kind of coalescing around. And lots of different kinds of groups. We're talking about Ku Klux Klan, we're talking about neo-Nazi groups, and then we're talking about more recently formed groups that don't quite fit that traditional mold.
And is there sort of a central authority that is perhaps sort of coordinating all of these very disparate groups who are sort of part of that same ideology? Or do they sort of work, independently and separately from one another?
It's a very decentralized movement. The kind of glue that holds it together is the agreement on certain ideals, and really the role that ideas play in the movement is very central. But as far as the organizations themselves, they tend to operate in overlapping ways, but in decentralized way. You don't have one centralized command structure, for instance. But you do have leaders, and the leaders, are kind of emergent in some situations, and then that may change in other situations. It's going to vary from group to group. So sometimes people think of this movement as completely disorganized because they confuse that with the large degree of decentralization. Yeah. And that is also strategic. So they promote decentralized leadership as a way to avoid criminal and civil prosecution for things like these shooting rampages.
Wow. And so are there particular groups right now, sort of within the white power movement, that are the most ascendant, and the leaders of which are perhaps the most prominent, where other people might be attracted to them, like who are sort of thinking about joining this movement? So do we have any individuals in the movement that are most prominent?
Well, there's certain individuals who've gotten a lot of media attention. So for instance, Richard Spencer, Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer. These are single individuals who have gotten a lot of media attention attention and have done a pretty good job too in terms of exploiting that attention in many ways. Sure. And then there's certain groups that have received quite a bit of attention, some because they kind of represent something that's a little bit different. So for instance, there was a group in Southern California that was formed, the Rise Above movement, and they were organized around MMA fighting and CrossFit training. And they would put out propaganda videos that showed themselves doing training. Now they were also using that training to go to different political rallies, Berkeley twice, Huntington Beach in Southern California, ultimately Charlottesville. And they would essentially attend those rallies and assault people based on the fighting skills that they'd been developing. One of their members had was a PhD student at UCLA and actually was working for Northrop Grumman, defense contractor. He had a security clearance. And so several of their members were arrested on federal charges. Some were ultimately accepted plea agreements, and others actually the charges were dismissed, so they're walking around now. So there are certain newer groups that have received a fair amount of attention.
I see. So what are some of the factors that would contribute to somebody joining this movement? What are some of the push and pull factors that individuals would join this movement for?
Yeah, so it really does vary quite a bit. The folks who get involved in these groups really do represent a broad cross-section of the white population. One of the things we don't find are any clear patterns in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds. They come from middle-class families, upper-class families, lower-class families. So that really, kind of runs the whole gamut. We do tend to find concentrations of kind of vulnerabilities in certain ways. So individuals report experiencing higher levels than you'd expect, say, in the general population of things like physical abuse as a child or sexual abuse, growing up in families where there's substance abuse problems, parental neglect. So these kinds of things seem to happen at a higher rate among a fairly large segment of folks who get involved. But it's not, exclusive. I mean, you do find individuals who don't necessarily have those experiences in their background. And that's fairly similar to what we find with individuals who end up, kind of falling prey to, say, chronic criminality or get involved in conventional street gangs. So there's a lot of similarity there. And then the pull factors, really are kind of things that you wouldn't be surprised by, but that can be still quite powerful. So the groups essentially promise the idea of family. They promise that they're going to provide this social support system, that you're going to be part of this special kind of elite group of people who have this special insight and understand the world in a way that most people don't. And so in a way that kind of operates like a cult in some respects.
Wow. And so do they actively go out recruiting people, or, how do they socialize individuals to sort of join this movement?
It happens in a lot of different ways. Of course, more recently, we're seeing a lot of recruitment happening online. Prior to the internet, a lot of the recruiting was happening offline in terms of music shows where they might go to, say, a youth subcultural event where, like, say, a punk music show. That was common in the 80s where neo-Nazis would attend those music shows and try and find kids at those, or they would go to schools and try and recruit at schools. Now, of course, the landscape of the digital landscape in terms of web forums and social media platforms are providing just a whole avenue of different ways that they can recruit. And some of it's pretty creative, but also really sad in some respects, where they'll actually essentially use predatory efforts to go to, say, social forums, web forums, where individuals with, say, depression problems are congregating and looking for social support. So they'll seek those sites out, knowing that there may be vulnerable individuals who might be more susceptible to their messaging and their promises of social support.
Wow. And so you've studied these groups for such a long time. How widespread is this movement?
We don't have good numbers. Haven't really had good numbers for a number of years. It's for a number of reasons, really. One is that a lot of these groups really conceal themselves pretty well. They're hiding, essentially, and that's part of, again, the strategy. They also talk a lot about infiltrating society. So, in the 80s and 90s, think about the skinheads with the shaved heads and tattoos, or Klans folks with the, white sheets and the hoods and robes and all that. They really started advocating for efforts to kind of, cover up the tattoos, grow your hair out, don't wear uniforms, do things like that make it harder for people to know that you're actually involved in the movement. Get a good job. Go to school, join the military, become a police officer, become a doctor, become a lawyer. So that's been a kind of a mantra and a strategy for the movement for decades.
Wow. And so you've talked about, the hidden spaces of hate. And what are those hidden spaces of hate, and how do they sort of then tend to cultivate those values there?
Yeah, well, so first foremost is the family. So they see the family as kind of the foundation for the movement. And they, as an individual gets involved in the movement and has children, then they hope to pass on their beliefs to their children. And they want to kind of raise the next generation of what they might call race warriors. So the family becomes a way for them to do activism, to essentially be really politically active. They use techniques like homeschooling, for instance, to try and pass on, and get their kids involved in the movement. Sometimes very elaborate strategies in terms of dressing up their babies in Klan regalia, as early as infancy. I've observed 5-year-olds already doing the Nazi salute and singing neo-Nazi music lyrics that their parents had taught them.
And you've spent time with such families, right? You described in your book a particular birthday party that you attended. Could you describe that for us?
Sure. Yeah, it was a party where they had a birthday cake that was in the form of a swastika, which is actually fairly common in the movement to do things like that. They'll use symbols and slogans on the cake. 14, which is the 14 words, which is a famous mantra within the movement. So they'll give toys to the kids. Instead of a G.I. Joe, they might make the G.I. Joe into a Nazi. So things of that nature, T-shirts that are movement related, maybe with a swastika or something a little more subtle. So you get variation there in terms of how overt the things they are trying to do in terms of pass it on. Some of the families are much more kind of hardcore about it, and they really do very obvious things in terms of passing on this kind of hatred, and others do kind of what we call soft sell, where they realize that if they push their kids too hard, their kids actually might end up going in the direction that they don't want them to go and reject their racist beliefs.
Right.
So then they'll try and do things in a little more subtle fashion.
What an example?
So they'll talk about things, and this is actually the movement and more broadly is doing this as well, is they'll talk about things like heritage. It's not about hate, it's about, just loving your roots and being proud of where you come from, sending kind of messages along those lines. But of course, those are also laced with anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia and xenophobia and so forth.
Of course. And you've talked about this effort to sort of appear normal and sort of part of mainstream society. And these groups have also put in a lot of effort in trying to rebrand themselves and sort of sanitize how they, a certain version of themselves that would be perhaps more acceptable. So like you mentioned, they would call the movement white preservation movement, or calling themselves white nationalists, or more recently the alt-right. So what are the dangers that these things present, and what influence do they have on mainstream America?
Yeah, so these efforts have been underway for decades. They've been, if you go back to, for instance, the late 70s, folks like David Duke, there was this effort to kind of a suit and tie approach, so to speak. And Spike Lee's movie Black Klansman actually illustrates some of these strategies. So they've been at work. They had some degree of effectiveness and success with this over the years, but more recently, it's been surprising to see how effective. Because, for instance, the term white nationalism, we really didn't hear that term used very often until it seems to around Charlottesville. And then since Charlottesville, that really has become a term of choice for folks in the media and the general public, policymakers and so forth. The academics who study this issue use the term now pretty commonly. And yet it's a term that they've been promoting because they believe it's kind of a more innocuous term, that it sounds less threatening and is better able to kind of confuse people. And really that's their goal in a lot of ways with terminology and words, is that they're playing kind of a war of words trying to confuse people about what they represent. And I think they've been actually in recent, just the last few years, they've been quite successful at that, which I find pretty disturbing.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. We use the term white nationalism all the time before you actually let us know that that is something that's a euphemism that some of these groups have used for themselves, and that's what they would prefer to be called in order to sort of sanitize themselves somewhat. So there are many people, and again, you said you don't have the numbers, but there, perhaps, thousands of people who've sort of joined this movement. But what leads some of them within the movement to actually engage in violent action? For instance, we had Wade Michael Page, who, while you were doing your research in early 2000 and 2001, you had spent some time with, and later in 2012, he went and actually attacked a Sikh temple in Wisconsin and killed 6 Sikh worshippers. Did you know at that time that he had certain signs that would compel him to then engage in violent action? I mean, are there symptoms? Like, how can one tell who would then go ahead and engage in violence?
Yeah, so, I had, with Page, I had no idea that he would, of course, this was 10 years lapse between the time I spent with him and when he ultimately committed that shooting rampage. So he, and I think, I learned several things from him. One, I learned from him directly how he got radicalized, which was during his time in the U.S. Army. He met someone who was already enlisted and who was already a neo-Nazi, and that person started to indoctrinate him. So he explained to me that kind of process of his own radicalization in terms of becoming involved in the movement. But really, up to the point I spent time with him, he had not been violent. He was involved, very heavily involved in the movement. He was most involved in the music aspect. They have a pretty vibrant kind of neo-Nazi music scene that's global. It's been global for decades. And he was involved in that. He played bass guitar, had played bass guitar since his childhood. And so when he first got involved in the movement, he really found the music to be the kind of most vital way for him to be active in the movement. He saw his music and being a musician as a form of activism. Like, that was his contribution to helping save the white race, is by playing this kind of music. And he toured all over the United States and actually all over the world, well, at least Europe.
And through the music, they would be perpetuating that ideology?
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what the lyrics would be about? Okay.
Sure, some of the songs are very explicit. Some of the bands have names like Hate Crime. And then like one of the bands he played in was Youngland. And a lot of their songs were a little bit more kind of coded. Stand one, stand all, I'm for you, you're for me. So not necessarily lyrics that would be a dead giveaway that they were necessarily neo-Nazi. And that also had a strategic aspect to it as well, because you could reach a wider audience with those types of lyrics than with ones that were really clear and in your face. So that was kind of how he was involved, but over time, and this happens to folks, it seems that there's somewhat of a pattern for individuals who ultimately kind of take the kind of action that he took in terms of that kind of violence, is that the level of involvement that doesn't include violence isn't enough. And they begin to see that really talk is cheap, basically. And so they begin to embrace this identity of being kind of a warrior, and the true warrior has to take real action, and real action means violence.
Wow. And you sort of talked about the culture within which, violence is then glorified.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the culture promotes the idea of warriors. So in a way, they're all kind of see themselves as warriors, but there's warriors that, for the most part, aren't necessarily certainly aren't involved in that kind of violence.
Yeah.
Fortunately, obviously, the violence that those who are violent may be like bar fights and that kind of thing. In some cases, it may be more predatory violence, but it's still relatively interpersonal attack. So maybe a one or two victims.
Yeah.
It's not a mass, an act of mass casualty violence. That level is just a whole, kind of a whole other level that most, fortunately, don't reach in terms of that level of involvement in violence. But for those who do, it seems to be one of the factors that's important is that it's a truly embracing this warrior identity that's part of the culture, but it's not necessarily practiced by all of the members of the culture.
But you've mentioned in your book how a lot of these people in the movement are encouraged to join the military or join law enforcement so that they're able to get the training that they might need to perhaps even, be more effective in the movement.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of multifaceted in the respect for why they would do that. One is that, you're going to get the training, and it's that preparation for what they believe is going to be happening in the near future, which is a race war. And so they need to have, their folks need to be prepared for that. And so being in the military and working in police, you get that training. But it's also a way for them to feel like they're influencing society from within by having people in kind of these positions, and whether it's the military or police, but also in other, education, for instance, having teachers, that they can kind of shape society in the direction that they want society to move.
Wow. And so, we've been talking over the past, 20 minutes about active members in the movement, some who have engaged in violence, others who are part of the movement, who have been socializing their children, their families sort of into this ideology. Recently, Professor George Hawley at the University of Alabama conducted research, and he found that 5.64% of non-Hispanic white Americans subscribe to this certain aspects of this ideology. And so that translates into about 11 million people who will not be found at rallies, who do not, have tiki torches that they're marching around in. But as one publication put it, they will be voting in the next election. And they sort of subscribe to this identity, this sort of movement, especially in terms of white victimization and white identity and the need to have solidarity around this identity. So how do you respond to something like that? And what can be done to address this phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a broader problem than just the movement. The movement represents the tip of a much larger iceberg in a way. And so then that begs certain questions. Why is there a segment of the white population that feels so aggrieved? What is it in terms of their experiences that's driving that? Of course, we know, one of the best predictors for voting for Donald Trump was this sense of kind of racial anxiety, right? It wasn't really economic insecurity the way some folks had suggested. It was actually more about the sense of white privilege being challenged, right?
Right.
And so, I think there's kind of has to be dealt with two prongs. There has to be a multifaceted approach, and it's hard to say, well, what among adults who feel this way, what's the response? That's a tough one. What we definitely need to be doing a better job is having this kind of a honest, open dialogue with our children, and where white children need to be brought into the discussion in terms of, I think, getting much more early education around the importance of diversity and how it's a strength, not a threat.
Sure.
And much more intergroup cooperation emphasis among young children. And then I think for white adolescents, I think there needs to be some forums for them to be able to express some of their anxieties, concerns, so that if we can kind of get this on the table a little bit more, it's not something that gets kind of inflated into this sense of aggrieved, kind of entitlement, where people then become much more hostile about it.
Right.
I think if we had these discussions earlier on with our children, we'd be able to kind of stem the tide of this more effectively.
Right, and sort of in that same vein, you've also suggested in your book that perhaps, shutting down these spaces where some of these adolescents vent their anxieties or sort of talk about these issues, completely shutting them down might be counterproductive as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tricky in terms of, so if you look at, for instance, the online space, one of the efforts now we're seeing kind of promoted is deplatforming. But if you look at, for instance, the Anti-Defamation League's study of Twitter's efforts to deplatform, what they find is those who are, kicked off of Twitter go to what's called Gab, which is essentially a white supremacist version of Twitter.
Right.
So the question is, do we want them on Gab or do we want them on Twitter? So deplatforming doesn't really get them off social media, it just changes the venue.
Sure. And so DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, after a very long time, has finally just last week came out with a report in which they characterized white supremacist violence as one of the major national security threats to the country right now, and that is after successive administrations had sort of failed to do that. How optimistic are you that this step will, or at least this acknowledgement, is going to translate into effective action in trying to sort of counter the threat that these groups pose?
Well, I try to remain optimistic about most things, but the proof's in the pudding, and history sometimes is a pretty good predictor. And so, we've seen at various points in time, talk about, focusing on X, Y, or Z. And until we see actual resources devoted and committed, then I have to be a little bit skeptical. This is a step in the right direction, but it's a relatively small step, and it's taken an awful long time too. Which I know it's better late than never, but that's part of the problem. And we also have to put that on the table. Why has it taken us so long to address this problem? And to be more aware of it, because the problem's been there. We've just minimized and denied it.
Sure. And I mean, I think it's interesting that it sort of happened under the Trump administration. Do you think there was enough, perhaps, public pressure that led to this, at least acknowledgement, because of how, a lot of people consider the administration sort of complicit in perpetuating this kind of rhetoric and everything? So sort of ironic that it happened now.
It is, and that's again part of my skepticism, because this has been an administration that's been a huge jolt of energy for the white supremacist movement. Right. First the campaign, and then and I'm not saying all white supremacists necessarily are Trump supporters, but certainly a segment are, and his rhetoric, even if they're not supporters, it still aligns with their messaging and their language. And so the fact that he speaks the language of white supremacy has been a huge energizing force for this movement.
Very true. Well, we've unfortunately run out of time, Dr. Simi, but thank you so much for your insights. You've given us so much to think about, and we hope you'll join us next time. So thanks for having me. Yeah. Thank you.